All right, everyone. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many of you here on a cold winter day, and we have quite a few people online as well. I'm just delighted. So welcome to our first Healy event, Hubbell Environmental Law Initiative this semester. I'm Shannon Raitzler. I'm a faculty member here at the College of Law. It's great to see so many students, so many familiar faces from across campus. It's warming my heart on this Valentine's Day. So thank you for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce our two guests today and the subject generally. Before I do, I want to say thank you to Fred and Charlotte Hubbell for funding the initiative and wonderful programs such as this one. We are incredibly grateful for their generosity. I want to thank Blake Roop, who's fortunately in the room this time. She's usually out of the room when I thank her, our wonderful program director, for putting all of this together. And of course, our two guests for joining us today. So judging from attendance, this is indeed the topic we thought it would be. People are interested. For some time in my field in environmental law and also in the insurance and risk management realm, people have been talking about climate change and insurance, homeowners and insurance in particular. But last spring, Blake and I noticed an article written by Chris Flavelle that coined the phrase Iowa effect, right? He came to Iowa and we've tried to share that article widely. So I'm hoping many of you have read it in advance to really describe what is a national phenomenon. When we think of climate change and its effect on insurance law, we might be thinking Florida, or we might be thinking California and all they're experiencing with the wildfires. And we might not be thinking of the Midwest or states like Iowa, but in fact, insurance markets here are experiencing a downturn. And so we're going to hear from both Chris Flavelle and also from Martin Grace. I'll introduce them both in a minute on some of the causal factors there. And in addition to climate change, it's not just climate change, but one of many. We have some questions you've already submitted. We have note cards that we can distribute for your questions, right? I will filter them as the moderator, and I'll try to check in online and get questions there. Chris Flavelle has especially emphasized that he doesn't like to talk for a long time. He's going to introduce the topic, maybe talk for 5 minutes, but he really thinks Q&A is much more interesting. And so we should have plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our two guests. Chris Flavelle is a reporter at the New York Times. He writes about how climate change affects the daily lives of Americans, including our homes, wealth, drinking water, food supply, health, and physical safety, and the steps that governments, companies, and communities are taking to try to cope with those growing shocks. His work focuses on the potential, but also the trade-offs and limitations of adapting to climate change. He's covered climate change for more than a decade. His work on climate adaptation has received awards from the National Press Foundation and the Society of Environmental Journalists. And I just have to say, as someone who works in this field, I'm so excited to have him here and so appreciate the work he has done at the Times, he and his team, other colleagues at the Times as well, on climate adaptation and groundwater and other issues. I am also pleased to introduce Professor Martin Grace. He is the Clement T and Sylvia Hanson Family Chair of Finance at the University of Iowa Tippie College of Business's Risk Management and Insurance Program, and also serves as the faculty director of the Vaughan Institute of Risk Management and Insurance. We were really fortunate that he joined us here just this last fall. Martin has a JD and a PhD in economics from the University of Florida. In his work, he studies the intersection of law and risk management and insurance. His research discusses the impact of catastrophic events on insurance companies and explores new ways of of insuring for catastrophes. So I'm going to transition to Chris Flavelle here in just a second. This is a little shout out for our next event along the way here. We are pleased to be hosting the author of the book Barron's Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry in a couple weeks, right? We would love to have you come for that book talk. So I am going to, Chris, I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see you. And now I need to change the view. Speaker, right? Why isn't it bigger? Okay, well, that seemed counterintuitive, but oh. Okay, so we can see you now. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you for having me. So let me just make a few opening remarks, and then, as you noted, I don't love listening to myself talk. I'd much rather hear questions, and we can proceed that way. I'm Chris Flavelle. I'm on the climate team at the New York Times. Spent a lot of time last year writing about climate change and home insurance, and was in Iowa and really enjoyed my time in Iowa because the thrust of that reporting started from the premise that anyone who's paying attention to this stuff knows that the home insurance market in California and Florida and Louisiana and places like that, North Carolina, is struggling a bit because of disasters increasing costs. What seemed important last year, and what I wanted to help my readers understand, was that that can use the word crisis. That crisis is no longer limited to those obviously high-risk states. It is very much spreading across the country, even to places that until very recently would have seemed, if not low risk, then not especially high risk. And Iowa was a great example of that. So I came to Iowa trying to find out what insurance companies and insurance agents and homeowners are experiencing as severe storms get worse. And the story wound up being one of a pretty clear causal chain. Storms becoming more severe, damages from storms increasing, insurers struggling to raise premiums fast enough to remain profitable. And given that struggle, a lot of insurers either reducing their coverage, trying to increase premiums as fast as they could, and when that wasn't enough, pulling out. And Iowa is not alone. It is very similar to a lot of states in the Midwest in terms of the effect of severe storms, making it harder for home insurers to be profitable. And a sort of intriguing window into the question of, well, what next, right? The story was trying to give readers some sense of the nature of this problem, the various factors feeding this problem. As you note, it's not just climate change. It's climate change in conjunction with rising home values and home repair costs, climate change in conjunction with more people living in high-risk areas, climate change in conjunction with states that are struggling to keep up from a regulatory point of view. State officials around the country are wrestling with this and how to balance keeping insurance affordable and also available. And what makes it interesting is there's no easy answers. So Iowa was a good place to tell that story from. And my sense is that state officials in Iowa and elsewhere, as well as federal officials, are watching this closely and trying to find out what to do, because obviously the stakes are huge, right? As I'm sure everyone knows, if you can't get home insurance, you can't get a mortgage. If few people can get a mortgage, that's fewer home buyers. That drives down home values. So the importance of this seems pretty clear, and it's not going away. Unlike other policy issues that can sort of become more or less important based on who's in office, the question of rising home insurance rates is just unavoidable. And I think it'll become increasingly urgent and painful as time goes on. So I appreciate the interest and really thrilled to try and field whatever questions you guys might have.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to share the screen again because Professor Grace has some slides, and then so we'll hear from him, and then we'll turn it over to the Q&A. There. Right there. There we go.
Thank you for inviting me today. It's nice to be on this side of the river. I think it's like the second time I've been on this side of the river since I've been here. I joined last August, and so I've been walking to work and walking home, and I haven't been really taking my time to go around campus. So I'm happy to be here today to chat with you all. Now, what's interesting is that Chris and I probably have 90% agreement, and but I got here on my first day and I said, "Oh, Iowa was kind of interesting. It's low risk." And everyone in my office said, "No, it's not low risk." I mean, and it's got derechos, it's got floods, it's got tornadoes. You know, it just kept going on. And so I just was looking at the tornado thing the other day. This is a map of all the tornadoes since 1950. It looks like Iowa is equally likely to hit with anywhere in Iowa. Any square centimeter in Iowa is going to get hit with a tornado in the next 50 years, which I thought was pretty interesting and pretty risky. But what I thought I would talk about, and some of this Chris already mentioned, but I'm going to maybe give a little color to it. Pricing I'm going to want to walk through how insurers think about pricing, just so that you know what an insurance price might mean. Talk about regulation just a little bit, because there is no federal regulator for insurance, and I'll talk about that too. I'll talk about climate but I want to talk about cost too. But they're interrelated. And the way Chris phrased it, he said climate and. I want to reinforce that, but we don't really know how much is which. But they're both together and we can't disentangle them. And then I have I call them lame solutions. And the reason they're lame is they're not sexy. You can't fix them overnight. It takes a long time to build and change things. And so it's not lame, it's just realistic, I guess, is part of it. And there's some other things I didn't talk about that I saw that people had questions about, and maybe we'll get to talk about that. So just quickly, prices, you probably sort of understand this, are based upon the expected value of a loss. So the frequency times the severity, that's a big chunk of what you're paying for when you buy insurance. And there's a little bit of cost of administration to, make sure Jake from State Farm has a nice living. But that really isn't very much. I mean, the cost of administration is really, somebody has to come out to your house and sort of figure out what your loss is. And now, you can do that on a phone with a picture. It's getting cheaper. The cost of capital. We need investors to put money inside the insurance company, because if they don't do that, we don't have an insurance company, because it's all the premiums we have aren't nearly enough to cover the risk. And then we have the cost of safety, because when you have a claim, you want the insurance company to say, yes, we'll be happy to pay your claim. And if a company doesn't have any reserves because it hasn't been reserving properly, they can't pay claims. So what affects this cost of safety? And this is something that is affected by climate change. So we have uncertainty about the frequency and severity. Auto insurance, no. Everyone, that's easy to price, not a big deal. Fire insurance, a little bit harder, especially for contagions, some conflagrations, like in Philadelphia, where I just moved from. Everybody lived in a row house. The first house has a kitchen fire, and the chance of the rest of the houses getting damaged is much higher. The wildfire scenario in California, the hurricane scenario in Florida, these are all contagion effects. And the more uncertain we are about that contagion, the higher the price has to be, because we need to be able to pay claims when the event happens. And when you have a hurricane, it's not just one person asking for a claim, it's thousands of people asking for, hundreds of thousands of people asking for a claim. So we have to worry about these things. And that's what goes into the price of insurance. Just to give you a feel, if you were to take the average house and add $100,000 to it, how much would it cost in some cities in Iowa? So 384 in Dubuque, 552 in Council Bluffs. And, to be honest, I don't know where either of those cities are. I've looked them on the map and I've already forgotten. But I know where Iowa City is. So I did look at that. And I have a house in Lakeland, Florida, which is in the middle of Florida. Think between Orlando and Tampa, but like in the middle of the state. Farthest you can possibly be from a storm. It's $1,100 for that extra incremental $100,000. And that's with a 10% wind deductible. So Florida is an expensive place to live. And relatively, Iowa is a less expensive place to live from an insurance perspective. And then the Pacific Palisades, I got data from insurer.com. And they do it by zip code and everything. And I could look at these numbers before the fire. I don't know what it would be afterwards, but the risk there seems kind of like Iowa. Okay. All right, regulation. So regulation is at the state level. And this goes back to a federal law passed at the end of World War II that took and placed the regulation of insurance with the states. And lots of people over the last 50 years have been trying to say, maybe the federal government should take this over. I had a project with the Brookings Institute right before the financial crisis, and we were actually thinking that might happen, but that was almost 15 years ago, and nothing's going on anymore. So I think it's kind of dead. But some regulators are elected. Some are appointed by the governor, or there's one or two that are appointed by the legislature. But they all have political and business reputations, and they want to do good by the people of their state. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rock on one side is the voters, on the hard place on the other side is the insurance company saying, we're out of here. Because insurance is a voluntary business. It's not a public utility. So once you come in the state, if you can't make money, you can leave. I mean, you might have to, go through some small hoops, but they're relatively low. Okay. So I have my University of Florida colors where I got my law degree, and the University of Iowa colors down here. So you can see the difference. But, Iowa is not as low risk as you'd think. And, Florida during, some points has got really low volatility, and then it has crazy times. And then it has low times again, and it has crazy times again. But Iowa has this nice little cycle where things happen. But if you look at the blue dot here, this is the average sort of loss ratio, where loss ratio is the loss divided by the premiums in the state, kind of indication how much is being paid out as a relative to the premium dollar. You can see that, in both cases, the Florida is often a little bit higher than, a little bit lower than the US, and Iowa is a little bit higher than the US going. So this is not necessarily an Iowa's high or low risk, but it's riskier than you think. Okay. So climate versus cost. Well, one thing that we have is something called multi-decadal oscillation. And it's not just one, like the Atlantic Ocean temperature. It's the Atlantic Ocean temperature, the North Atlantic. It's the El Nino cycle. The whole world has a bunch of cycles, and they don't overlap. Very difficult for weather forecasters to sort of use all this information to say, we're going to have more wet weather, we're going to have more dry weather. Weather forecasting, especially over a long period of time, is very difficult. And as a result, insurance prices are going up because of that uncertainty, right? So just think that in your head. Losses are getting bigger. And this is the thing that Chris was talking about, climate change plus. When I first went to the University of Florida in 1980, nobody lived on the eastern coast of Florida except out like in Miami where they had condos. Now it's like condo from the one tip all the way up to Jacksonville, the Georgia border. It's very different. We've moved there. We've put assets in harm's way. Florida is probably one of the riskiest places in the country, and we're doubling down on how much risk we're putting into it. More people in high-risk areas, more concentration in high-risk areas. And when that happens, we have that contagion, that cost. We've also had economic inflation. So Chris mentioned this. Home prices have been up on average, and every state's a little bit different, but average 40%. U.S. construction repair costs go up 40%. Insurance prices have gone up about 22% on average. Some, in some states it's more, in some states it's less, but on average it's 22. Reinsurance costs, this is the insurance for insurers, have gone up 33%. So if we think about all these things that are going into the cost of insurance, it's not necessarily that we have the crisis like we're thinking about, but we have a shock from inflation. Now we still have climate still going on there, but a lot of this is because of inflation. Now, I like this graph because this is what everyone thinks. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, and I know the slope, right? And so this is last year's report from Swiss Re. And I put in yellow with a red dot what Swiss Re reported this year. So it's almost exactly on that dot. So we are thinking that even though I'm saying it's inflation, we're thinking the world is looking like this. And that's how, when we want to make public policy or we want to do something, that's what we're thinking. But here is, I think, another way of thinking about it. So this is for Iowa and the Midwest convective storms. Now, I would like to have found one like this for hurricanes, but they haven't done one yet. But for Iowa convective storms, we have on average, an 8% increase in 2022 to 23 in homeowners insurance prices in Iowa. 2.2 is general inflation. 1.2 is inflation for repair and material. 2.3 for economic growth, urbanization, spatial expansion. Don't really know what that means. 1% climate, that's a high level estimate. And this is Swiss Re. These economists at Swiss Re are actually believers in man-made climate change. So this is they're kind of biased there, and their highest estimate is 1%. So I just want to point that out. And this is for Iowa. This is the Midwest. Okay. And then we have what are called society and behavioral trends. Some of that is what people are calling social inflation. We'll give, if someone sues an insurance company in court, the jury is more likely to give them more money. Some of it has to do with, our housing stock is declining in quality. And we can't really measure that very well. So there's some other costs in there. So what's interesting about it, that inflation is not a trivial thing relative to climate change today. Okay. So I'm going to just sort of wrap up so we have time for questions, because I think there's a lot of questions here. So is there an insurance crisis? And I'm of two minds of this. Yes, price shocks make people worry and wonder they can continue to pay higher and higher insurance prices for their homes. This is a very big concern. Another thing is that, we've had price shocks like this before. One was in 1973. It was an oil price shock, and it affected automobile insurance pricing for 10 years. And a tremendous amount of inflation, and people were saying, my auto insurance is going up. We have to regulate the heck out of it. And they did. And they wrecked insurance markets in New Jersey, Massachusetts, North Carolina for 10, 15 years. So I'm just going to say that we should find something else rather than clamping down on the free market, if you will. So it's not clear, whether there's a crisis or not, but we definitely need to be thinking about the future. So what are some things we could do? This is the lame part. Housing stock changes very slowly. So those of you that own a home, what kind of, other than just getting a new kitchen or a new bathroom, have you done anything structural to your house? Have you replaced the electricity? Have you replaced the roof tie down? Have you changed the shape of your roof to be less amenable to getting ripped in a storm? So there's lots of things you can do, but most people don't do it. And it takes time, or it takes damage before that happens. Now, some states have tax credits. Like in California, there's an earthquake tax credit that allows you to sort of fix your foundation to make it sturdier. You get a tax credit from that. Florida has reductions in premiums Like it's about 50%, if you will, for having these, I call them Kevlar straps that keep your roof on your house. And they're tied to the foundation and they strap your roof down. FEMA also has programs where they, and I think Iowa City belongs to one, where they rate the community on how well they're managing their flood risk, and their flood premiums are lower as a result. And then this is a nonprofit. It's the Institute for Business and Home Safety. And they have this fortified home standard. It's not a building code. It's the way you build. And they did an experiment. Well, actually, the hurricane did an experiment in Alabama, and the houses that were built according to their fortified home standard survived a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane, and the ones next door did not. So this was a nice little experiment that Mother Nature gave us. And, you know, another thing is that it might be that we're exhausted by this. I just read in the Wall Street Journal last week that Florida is seeing a real estate slowdown, and they attribute it to the high cost of insurance. I also think that people, you know, the major move that was caused by COVID is over now, and people are sort of settled, and the interstate transportation or interstate moving for just willy-nilly reasons is over. So the real estate markets are settling, which should have an effect on the price of homes. They'll never go down because inflation has built them up, but they won't be going up again. They won't be going up again. So that's kind of my thing in a nutshell, and we still have lots of time for questions.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Look at you. You're gonna fix it up.
Yeah, I know.
Wonderful.
I've been around this meeting before.
Excellent. Okay. Chris, can you hear me if I'm standing over here? Oh, excellent. We put in new microphones and they're working. Amazing. So I have some questions that were submitted before and one online. If you have a note card, can you wave it for Blake maybe to come by and get it? Am I collecting them? So I think I'll start with the online question. It's kind of long, so I'm going to try to paraphrase. I think both of you might have something to say about this. There's a little skepticism here of what's going on with insurance companies dropping their customers, right? So this person says that they are bringing in record profits, so they seem to be profitable, and they can diversify, right, their risks and offer other kinds of insurance. And so she's wondering, why do insurance companies drop customers rather than raise premiums, right? They're just kind of digging down there on that phenomenon, right, Chris, that you've reported on, where we're seeing cancellations and just dropping of customers entirely. So I'm interested in your thoughts. Chris, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Thanks for that. It's a great question, and I spent a lot of time reporting last year asking that question. You get different answers. I think they all have some degree of truth to them. One answer is, sure, you can raise premiums, but it takes work to raise premiums, and you might not always get the premium rate increase you want. So you go to the state and say, well, I want, a 30% increase, and they'll just grant you 15 or 20. So raising rates isn't smooth, and it's not cost-free, and it's not always fast. Number one. Number two, insurers think in terms of concentration of risk. So you might think, okay, we've got, 100 homes in Iowa, right? Just for just sake of like a baseline. All right, it looks like we got 50 homes in this area of Iowa where we know there's high risk. That's too much. We want to better disperse our risk, so we're not so concentrated in this one part of the state. So you might drop for that reason to rebalance your risk. Number three, you might have reinsurance companies saying, well, I think you're too heavily exposed in this area. And so you say, all right, fine. I think it's good business, but you don't like it. If I can get better reinsurance rates by cutting my exposure in this part of the state, I'm going to drop people. And you could have maybe data from catastrophe modelers saying you expect rising losses in those areas. So you're right, sort of, Conceptually, one would think in a perfect market, you would just raise rates. It's not always possible. This isn't really an Iowa thing, but in some places, the threat is too hard to model, and insurers, even if they could raise rates quickly, they might not be comfortable that they'll get it right. And so if your risk in a certain area is sufficiently hard to model, you might decide you'd rather just have less exposure than try to take a guess and risk being wrong.
Do you want to ask?
So I'm going to agree with that 100%, and I can give you an example that I made fun a moment ago about the ratios, but that was a risk. That was a novel risk. I mean, it might have been around before, but it was a novel risk to the insurers in Iowa. And so we don't know how to model that. We don't even know what that. We've never heard of that. So it's a novel risk, and as Chris said, it's hard to model. And when you have a hard to model risk, the cost of safety goes up. And when the insurance commissioner says, "Now you have to give us more evidence. You can't just raise your rates." It's because you say you saw the ratio. What happened in the past? Your rates have to be forward-looking. Well, is it going to happen next year? You can't say. So he's right. It's work to try and get the regulator who's stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I agree with what you said. I can give you an Iowa example.
So I think there are a set of questions around the intersection of law, climate resilience, and the effect on insurance. So what in your reporting, Chris, and from your research, Professor Graves, what effect do state policies, you mentioned that in the presentation, that either give credit to homeowners for resilience measures, or actually we can say on the front end it's building code, right, that prescribe standards for new development. Do we see insurance markets responding to these measures?
Yeah, it's a vital question. Let me answer conceptually and then in practice. Conceptually, the first thing insurers and insurance experts will tell you is if you're concerned about the rapid increase in insurance costs, really the best thing you can do as a state policymaker or a local policymaker is pass better codes, right? I mean, Florida is a great example. Florida has wild exposure to disasters, but after Hurricane Andrew in '92 passed pretty good statewide building codes, and that made the state, a lot better off than would have been the case otherwise. California, likewise, pretty aggressive statewide building codes for wildfire hazard, and the result is the market hasn't collapsed. Every state's different. I actually confess I don't have a good idea of how Iowa approaches building codes, but in general, conceptually, if you want to reduce losses from storms and therefore, to some degree, reduce premium increases, pass tougher codes. That's conceptually. In execution, I think the number you hear is the housing stock turns over roughly 2% a year in terms of new construction. So it takes a long time for building codes to spread through the housing stock. There are programs that can help people pay for retrofits, which are very expensive, but can save money over time, and that can be useful. So yeah, it's a good idea to focus on state and local policies around building codes. It's hard to do it fast, and it's very expensive, right? Also, you never really know, right? It's one thing to say in the abstract, if everyone had a better roof or, better storm windows or whatever, yeah, in general, you're better off. But would a particular household be more protected in a way that you could justify it, right? This question that just came up of should insurers be compelled to offer discounts for homeowners that do resilience retrofits? Really tough. You'd think, given the conceptual link I just laid out, that would make sense. But insurers have a hard time quantifying it, right? So insurers tend to be reluctant to give some sort of credit or a discount to a homeowner because they did this or that thing, because though it's better overall, it's hard to quantify just how much better it is. So it's a real issue. I mean, I don't know I don't know to what degree tougher standards, whether at the point of construction or at rebuilding or redesigns, whether those will be viewed as sort of worth the cost, because no one likes spending money. Over time, like a lot of time, like decades, tougher codes should meaningfully address this problem. But for policymakers looking for a quick fix, quick being defined as like 2 to 5 years, it's unclear to what degree that's going to make a meaningful difference.
Well, you nailed it. That's exactly the way I think about it. There's a couple little side things you can do, so you can rate the building code inspectors. So in some parts of the country, there's good building codes, but the building code the building code enforcement group doesn't get a budget to really do a top-notch job. My insurance company actually tells me how they rate my county housing stock inspectors, so I'm not sure what it's called. But I think mine is a 3 out of 5 in Florida. And they said if I was a 4, I would say it's $400. So I think that's the way of getting me to lobby the town to spend more money in building code inspections. So I don't know how effective that is, because the insurers are going to say, I need a lot of data in order to figure out how much this is going to benefit the customer and me as being insured. And we just don't have, I think in Florida, if somebody did a data call today, they might be able to actually assess some of this. But we do it for fire departments. We rate the fire departments, AMBES, the private company, rates fire departments. So, this is something that we're doing, but it seems it's one of those lame things, it doesn't seem sexy because it's just, kind of enforcement.
Well, I think information is very important. So I'm going to ask a question that came up for me in conjunction with a question that was submitted when I was reviewing, Chris, your work. There is you note that there are some state insurance commissioners who are reluctant to dislike the federal government's data collection role, right? The resistance to efforts by the federal government to collect data. And I suspect, I have a question about red states, right, and climate change, but some of those are red states. But I'm curious what you think about that. Why are they so resistant to just getting the information we need at a national level to understand these trends? What's going on there?
We can't be in these people's heads, so I'm kind of at some level speculating here. I think there's a few things going on. I think when the federal governments over the last 2 years tried to get insurance companies and states and state regulators to share information, they ran into friction for a couple of reasons. One was states have, as noted, an ironclad grip on insurance regulation. I think they resented the idea that the federal government would get involved in that, or which would dilute state regulation power. Number two, there's, however well the market is working or not working, I think there's a legitimate fear if you get a change in regulation, could it make things worse? And for whom, right? So I think there's just inherent small c conservatism about how the system might change. I think there's also layered onto that, there remain, as we all know, in some parts of American life, resistance to talking about climate change. People will talk about it in code as like resilience or extreme weather or whatever. But anything that is tagged climate change can produce some inherent pushback from some parts of modern American life. So I think it's all those things. I don't know to what degree that reluctance to sort of study this and provide information really gets in the way. I think the real loser from that reluctance to share information probably isn't the federal government. it's probably homeowners, right? It is wickedly hard as a homeowner to get good information about what your insurance company is doing and why. And I just think, and it was kind of a boring topic, right? Home insurance until very recently was just so dull, right? And even when I pitched this coverage to my bosses, I had to say, like, I know it sounds boring, but just hear me out. And I think insurers maybe have become acclimatized to that environment of no one's going to pay too much attention, no one's going to scrutinize them. Homeowners won't ask questions because it's boring, and so they've gotten used to not answering questions. And I think that hopefully is a cultural attitude that will shift as more homeowners and more regulators are asking tough questions because more people as consumers are struggling with these costs. But I think it's just a marketplace that is not used to scrutiny, and that as a journalist strikes me as a problem.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, right? A marketplace that is not accustomed to this kind of scrutiny. Do you have thoughts on transparency?
So I started with this research in Florida after Hurricane Andrew, and it is about everybody in Florida is an expert. The whole state is an expert on homeowners insurance. They're experts on their favorite hurricane model. Which one of these spaghetti models do you like? So there's some areas where this has been a salient issue for a long time. And Florida's had so much press about insurance prices and homeowner insurance prices. So I think some states are like that, but other states are like us that, and it's only when it becomes episodically salient, like Cape Cod. I don't know how many years ago it was. Homeowners insurance rates went up in Cape Cod, and people freaked out. Massachusetts was all up in arms about that. So I think it's only salient when something comes up, and in between, nobody seems to care about it. I resent that because I live for homeowners, but I think it's kind of funny that Chris had to say, "I know it's homeowners insurance."
Yeah.
So, but it's salient everywhere right now. So I think more people are going to be asking questions, and it's not just the insurance companies. It's some regulators. For example, I would say California didn't want people asking questions about homeowners insurance from a regulatory perspective because they were doing some really different things, and they probably weren't sustainable in the long run. So that sort of came to light last year. So it's not just the insurance companies; it's regulators, it's the federal government too. I mean, they're always trying to stick it to the states if you're a state, and the federal government says, well, they don't know what they're doing, so we have to do it for them. So there's always this tension between the difference in the federal government. And some states say are more libertarian, conservative on this issue than others. But Chris, you don't need me. Chris is giving very good answers.
We need you both. So a set of questions around high-risk pools. We haven't really talked about them. Chris, you reported just recently, actually, you had a piece on California. And it's called FAIR, do I have that right? The program in California that's basically in a real pickle right now, right? Because of all the claims being filed in the wake of the wildfires. So the role of high-risk insurance, I think there are questions around who should fund that, right? Is it a taxpayer-funded pool? Are there alternatives? What are you seeing in the states where there are these high-risk state insurance pools?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we can I think approach this question from the perspective of what next, right? Where's this all going? Most states, I think 35 states, have what's called a residual market plan, a plan of last resort designed to insure people who can't get insurance on the regular markets. California has one called the FAIR Plan. Florida has one called Citizens. And the idea is if you got no other options, they'll take you. But it's more expensive coverage. It tends not to be very generous coverage. You don't want to be in those plans if you can avoid it. They raise the question of who pays. Contrary to public perception, they're not actually publicly subsidized programs or taxpayer subsidized programs. So in California, for example, the way it works, and this is suddenly topical, is the FAIR plan in California insures a lot of homes that can't get coverage from regular insurers because the risk is so high they won't touch them. Then during the LA wildfires last month, these homes covered by this plan took collectively a big hit. And so the FAIR plan said, what is it, Friday? I think on Tuesday, one day this week, they said to the state regulators, look, we don't have enough money to pay these claims. We've got to get help. And the way they do it is they level what's called an assessment, which is a bill sent to all insurers that operate in the California market. The bill was $1 billion divided among insurers based on how much of the market they had, based on market share. And insurers, in turn, under a rule negotiated with state regulators, they can pass on half of that cost to their customers, to homeowners, as a surcharge. The other half they're supposed to eat by cutting into profit. So you could argue that that's publicly funded in that basically not everyone in the state, but all state homeowners pay that. In Florida, when Citizens exceeds its capacity to pay claims, it has a similar facility where it can turn to levy assessments that ultimately winds up on the backs of homeowners. It's not quite taxpayers, but it's similar. So will we see more of that? Almost certainly, right? The share of homeowners that are in these residual market plans is going up in many states. There's a different way you could spread the risk, and this is becoming more of a conversation. As some of you may know, flood insurance is handled separately from home insurance. It's a federal program called the National Flood Insurance Program. It is subsidized when the federal flood insurance program exceeds its cash on hand in terms of claims. It can go to Treasury and seek money from Treasury paid directly by taxpayers. The question come up, will we have similar models for other perils? Wildfire, perhaps. Could you get a situation where you have a national subsidized market for home insurance? It's a stretch, but it's not impossible. So at some point, the risk gets socialized and subsidized. The question is how much of it and what's the mechanism? And also, is it a good idea? And that's, a normative question that's beyond the purview of my job. But the questions that come up is, if you start to subsidize and socialize the risk of home insurance, well, who wins? People in high-risk areas, but do you create a moral hazard? Do you create an incentive for people who live in high-risk areas to keep on building in those areas, to keep on moving into those areas, knowing that, well, as home insurance becomes less and less a standard traditional market, effectively their risk is being subsidized by everyone else. And that's what happened with flood insurance. Do we want that? Is that a good idea? Is a great question to debate. It's not a question a reporter gets into, but it's a question that's going to become, I think, much less hypothetical and much more real as the homeowner insurance market starts to look less healthy in lots of the country.
Great, and so this is perfect and why we need you both, because I'm going to pose the normative question. Right? For a long time, people have criticized the National Flood Insurance Program for moral hazards and all of the lines that Chris was just discussing. What are your thoughts about subsidizing these types of schools?
All right, so let's talk about a national plan first. And as I said, I've been thinking about Florida for a long time. And in 1996 or 7, the state legislature, the governor of Florida said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if the U.S. Treasury became a backstop for our cat problem? And, the senator from Iowa, it was probably Senator Grassley even back then, he said, no way, we're not going to subsidize your high life, living in condos in Miami and hurricane zones. We're not going to do that. That's the common thing. So we have this resentment it's not helpful. We have this aversion to paying people living in nice places subsidies to live in this nice place, which I think, you know, we all have this in our hearts. I think even if you can stand it down, yeah, we all have it. But you know, we don't mind paying for certain kinds of things after a disaster, like the North Carolina disaster. It's unprecedented. You know, the first time something like that happens, you know, we think of the United States as kind of a community, and we raise money to help our neighbors. But if we think about like the National Flood Plan, the way it's organized, people have been unhappy with it for a long, long time. Its prices aren't all closely related to risk. And so what happens is that people that live in high risk areas don't really pay anything close to the real risk that they put to the plan because of the charity has, you know, everybody else is going to pay. So this is a big problem in designing one of these gigantic social things because it's not like being poor, right? So you divide, you have this income line, and say if you're below here, this is the kind of support we give you. So you don't always have a choice of being poor. Well, you get to choose where you live. And so do we want to cause people to move to the high risk areas? That's the moral hazard, and this is what we're going to do. And think of the rules that will have to be put in place to keep that from happening. I could just see people rebelling in a small part against that kind of plan. So can we do it? Yes. Do we have a good example of it? No. So that's kind of how I would say it. I was on the board of the Georgia Underwriting Association, which is the FAIR Plan for Georgia. We had 5,000 houses. Right across the border in Florida, there were Citizens, which is an actual company. It's a corporation. It had, I don't know, half of the houses in Florida. We were lucky. We were saying, oh, we're so lucky. We're so good to live on this side of the border. But even people in Georgia didn't like this system. And while I was on the board, we never made an assessment, not once. So it was basically just for like the 98-year-old husband and wife who couldn't afford to bring their house up to code. And the electric code was so bad, they needed State Farm coverage. So they had to come. So it's these one-off. But in Florida and California, Iowa doesn't have a big, I think I looked, where you know, there's pressure, we're going to have to come up with something. Florida's is working. It charges a relatively high premium. I mean, it's not ridiculous. So State Farm may not insure you. So if you go to the Citizens, they'll cover you. But it's not cheap. You know, it's not free. It's not cheap. It's still a real insurance because that organization has to make money at the end of the day. They just have to pay shareholders. The cost of capital is the same. They still have to break even. And by doing so, we're basically placing in Florida, where half the people are in that private school, we're concentrating the risk in Florida. I remember when they first did this, the CFO of Florida was, I guess, an acquaintance of mine. And she, for the first few years, didn't have any money. I think she probably didn't sleep during hurricane season because if they had a hurricane, that company would have been wiped out. So start out this competition. But just thinking about, you know, the interstate differences in risk, the moral hazard, the adverse selection that can come up from this. It's a hard thing to do. So maybe it's a good thing to do. It's just a really hard thing. I was long-winded. I apologize.
No.
I'm thinking out.
No, I think we've got time for one more question. And I hate to end up being technical, but I think it's important. It was implicit in your presentation, and there are a couple questions about pricing. So premiums,
Okay.
right? Do insurance companies average premiums across states? Like, it sounds a lot like the markets are localized and regional. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to turn to Professor Grace first.
Okay, so
how are they pricing it?
So within a state, that's the authority of the regulator. So they can't regulate prices. So they look at data from that state. And then they look at, are you a brick house? Or you want a straw?
They classify them based upon how resilient they are to various risks. It's a fire code. When was it built? What kind of reach does it have? Just like, you would for automobile insurance. Hey, do you have any tickets? You have a red sports car. They look at these things and they put people into classes based upon those classifications. So it's averaged within classes of similarly situated people. So that's how that's how they figure out the expected losses. It's similarly situated people. They don't put apartment dwellers in with 7-bedroom homes.
Do they do this nationally or?
No, they do it locally because the way insurance rates have to be local. And so the only national stuff that might sneak into the back door is reinsurance. Because that reinsurance costs, it's a worldwide market for reinsurance, so there's like one price.
It's not like there's a Iowa price and there's a California price. And maybe the risks in Iowa are different, but the underlying costs of reinsurance are the same.
You can buy more or less based upon
We are getting low on time. Chris, I'm just gonna ask if there's anything that we've not asked about that you really feel like you want to convey. Any concluding remark?
I don't. This has been great. I just want to note, if somebody wants more information, so my colleague Mira and I did 3 stories on this last year, and the stories are all accompanied by like really extensive graphics that you can navigate. And on this question of premiums, we produced something on July 8th that lets you look at how the premiums in your zip code compare to every other zip code or county, I forget, one of those two, compare with every other part of the US. So again, as we discussed, the data here isn't very good. We worked pretty hard to get good data. I think like the thing I want to stress is the situation at the moment is not it's debatable whether the term crisis ought to apply. It's definitely, based on my reporting, getting worse. This is going to be a pinch point, right? Even if American voters would rather not talk about climate change, and even if state and federal officials would rather not talk about climate change, I think home insurance will be the thing that will force the conversation. And it's a truly fascinating problem because the answers aren't obvious. So I appreciate you all making time to talk about it. And if there's questions that we haven't got to, my email address is right out there. So just shoot me a note.
Very generous of you. Thank you. Professor Grace, do you have any concluding?
No, I really like to talk about insurance. No one in my house likes listening. So it's a nice room. And I appreciate being asked to come, and I enjoyed those.
Well, we want to thank you both for your time and for your expertise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks to all of you for coming. Stay warm.